Welcome back to the channel. In this video and podcast, I'm going to talk about 5 reasons that junk food and social media are similar to each other, very similar to each other. So what's the point of talking about this? Well, basically to kind of evaluate how both junk food and social media are impacting your life and what you can do about it in both cases, not just one. So alternatively, you could say the title of this could be how social media is like junk food for your brain. So this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I mean, social media and junk food aren't literally the same, but they have a lot of similarities. So I'm going to explain 5 similarities and then kind of some action steps that you can take as well regarding both. All right, and it's probably worth rethinking the place of junk food in your life, but also the place of certain forms of technology that can be harmful in your life. And there's some irony of posting this on YouTube, of course, because social media, YouTube has some social media-like features. It's kind of a hybrid of like a library of content and social media stuff. Anyway, but it's also on the podcast. So if you're on the podcast, that is not really like social media for the most part. So good on you. All right. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Ben. I'm a PA, which is similar to a doctor. And I talk a lot about health and nutrition and fasting because I have a lot of personal experience and I've spent a lot of time learning about it and so forth. All right. So let's get into it. So what's junk food? First of all, basically anything that's ultra processed is the epitome of junk food. Think of Twinkies, think of other similar things. So very processed. The more processed it is, the more junky it is in general, especially if it has refined sugar, refined flour, and refined or processed vegetable oils or seed oils. And the combination of those 3 things is basically what a snack cake is. You just mix those 3 together. All right. Or like think of like a sugary cereal. That's kind of similar too. All right, so some softer examples, not as junky, would be like white bread, but it's still pretty junky, just not quite as much as a snack cake. Some cereals, like I said, and then there's things that are kind of medium, right? Like a sugary yogurt, because the yogurt itself isn't as bad, but then they almost always have a bunch of sugar added. So it's kind of a spectrum of how junky junk food is, right? Social media, what's social media? I think you know the common example is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X. YouTube's a hybrid. There's other ones. I'm sure there's some trendy ones that I haven't even heard about that the young kids are using these days. So how are these similar and why should you care? I guess. So here's some ways that they're similar, just as food for thought, and then what to kind of do about it as well. So both junk food and social media are modern inventions. So this is reason number 1, reason number 1 why they're similar. They're both modern inventions. So junk food didn't really exist until the last 100 years or so, probably. I mean, there were like cakes and things probably 200 years ago, but it wasn't nearly as common. Let's put it that way. It's become exponentially more common if you look over the last few hundred years. All the processed food and little packages and so forth that you get from the grocery store or the convenience store or the fast food restaurant or other places. So it's ubiquitous now, whereas it was kind of rare maybe 200 years ago to have something you might call junk food. So it's definitely a modern invention from that standpoint. And then social media, obviously very modern, started in the last 20 years or so, basically. Now, reason number 2 why junk food and social media are similar is they're both very addictive. They're both very addictive. So it's quite clear that food, and especially junk food and especially sugar, is very addictive now. There's plenty of research and commentary and so forth. And if you don't have personal experience with that, count yourself lucky, but it's pretty obvious. If you want to learn more about that, you can listen to my interview with Jen Unwin. I talked about her book. Her book is called Fork in the Road, A Hopeful Guide to Food Freedom. And in her book talks a lot about the physiological effects of junk food addiction, sugar addiction. She usually says sugar addiction. Like you'll have an excess amount of dopamine and certain other neurotransmitters when you're using it, just like drugs. And then you'll have a deficit of those neurotransmitters when you stop using it, just like drugs. And there's other hormonal effects and things and this and that. So again, count yourself lucky if you don't have personal experience with food addiction. Think of it like if you're not an alcoholic. If you're not an alcoholic, you might be like, what? How can somebody get addicted to alcohol? But then you'd be like, oh, that's a dumb thing to say because obviously they're alcoholics. Same thing for sugar. If you're someone who can say, what? How could somebody get addicted to sugar? Count yourself lucky because you're not a sugaraholic. But some people are. A lot of people are, actually, I think. I think it's like a huge percentage of the population that has some degree of addiction to junk food. So anyway, that was a little tangent, sort of. But is social media addictive? Heck yes. Social media obviously creates urges and addiction for a lot of people, maybe most people that use it. That's why they're still using it. It's difficult. It can be difficult to stop. It can be difficult to kind of resist the urge to check it at random times. And it's actually engineered to be like slot machines. So gambling can be addictive, of course, and slot machines are a gambling mechanism. So Facebook and stuff is engineered to be like slot machines, because what happens when you open it, you have variable intermittent rewards. So you don't know if there's going to be 5 notifications or 0 or 10, and it could be somebody liked your photo, or it could be nothing, or it could be a bunch of stuff. So it's variable and intermittent rewards. So you want to check it to see what's going to happen, just like when you pull the lever on the slot machine. So that's one way that it's addictive. But it also, they try to engineer it to be as addictive as possible with like all the doom scrolling and rage bait and all these different things, right? That's kind of things are promoted if they're likely to create an emotional reaction and stuff like that. So it disrupts life just like other addictions, because it can make you stressed or angry at bedtime and you can't sleep because you're thinking about some argument you had on social media. So it fits the criteria for addiction for sure. All right, so the third reason why junk food and social media are similar is they both cause comparison envy. So the social media is kind of more obvious in this case, that there's a lot of comparison envy. And that's due to body kind of composition, or body, kind of, thinking that somebody else is more attractive than you. And sometimes the photos you're looking at are not real. They're like photoshopped or airbrushed or whatever the terminology is, especially with models and things like that. And that's been the case for a long time on magazines, but on social media, it's pretty common. Filters, are common and stuff like that. But it also creates comparison envy, just because people tend to post things like their awesome vacation or how their family's so great. And a lot of times it's just not even showing their whole life. It's just kind of a facade that they're putting up on social media. But then you compare yourself to it and you feel like crap, because you're like, I'm not that put together or whatever, or I'm not on an amazing vacation in Europe. What am I doing wrong? So comparison envy. But does junk food create comparison envy? Well, mainly just because if you're addicted to junk food, you're probably overweight and you don't like how your body looks and you wish you were like that other physically fit person down the road. So that's probably the main reason. But let's move on to reason number 4, why junk food and social media are similar. They both make kids depressed and sick. Isn't that great? So yeah, they both definitely do. And well, first let's talk about social media. So if you haven't seen the documentary called The Social Dilemma, go check it out for sure, because you'll understand a lot more of what I'm talking about if you watch that. It came out, I think, in 2020 on Netflix. So in that documentary, they showed a graph of how the timeline of when people started using smartphones and using social media more because they had smartphones and so forth. There's a strong correlation between that and self-harm and suicide among teen and preteen girls in particular. So there's a pretty close connection. It seems clear that it is at least partially causation. There's probably other factors as well. So using things like social media makes you more likely to hurt yourself or commit suicide. I think it's fair to say, even though it's more, in that case, it was more of a correlation, but I think it is at least partially causal, because it's pretty easy to understand why that would be the case with all the comparison envy and the cyberbullying and all the different things that are going on. Now, what about junk food? Does junk food make kids depressed and sick? Well, yeah. Childhood obesity, all the ADHD that's increasing like crazy among adults and kids. There's definitely a connection with junk food, with depression, anxiety, ADHD, and maybe autism too. That one's not as clear, but I think I heard somebody explaining how there was kind of a correlation with like insulin resistance and autism. But yeah, some food for thought, no pun intended, but definitely junk food makes kids sick and depressed in general, or anxious or other things. All right, so the 5th one might sound a little crazy, but it's probably true. I mean, at least for the social media. And that is that both junk food and social media are, well, again, more so the social media, incompatible with democracy. So again, this one's a little more about the social media, but we'll make a case for the junk food as well. So there's a guy named, oh wow, he's got quite a name, Daniel Schmelzenberger, who I've heard on several podcasts, not recently, but it was a couple years ago. And he talks a lot about different threats to civilization. And one of them is social media. Again, might sound crazy if you haven't thought about this before. But in general, social media is a threat to democracy and possibly incompatible with democracy, because the way that with the current incentives on Facebook and other platforms, people are rewarded for doing things that cause more and more polarization. And so the more polarized we become as a society, where we've got the left and the right, and you feel like you have to, fit in with that tribe or whatever, that kind of creates an incentive for candidates to also be more polarized, more extreme, and to just appeal to one far extreme of the spectrum. And therefore, these candidates are kind of crazy and extreme and fringe, and there's a loss of civility in the communication, and people kind of think the other side is always evil or crazy. And so I think you can see how that is not really compatible with democracy, because eventually it's going to go sideways with those types of incentives if that continues. And if you want to learn more about that, check out The Social Dilemma and check out any interview with Daniel Schmelzenberger. He's been on several podcasts, including Lex Friedman and others. All right. So is junk food incompatible with democracy? Yes and no. Right now, it's kind of driving I'm in the United States, of course, it's kind of driving our democracy into the ground, because it's going to bankrupt the country. And that's because there's all this lobbying and things with the healthcare system and the food industry and blah, blah, blah. And the junk food is creating a lot of chronic diseases that cost a lot of money in terms of healthcare, and a lot of money in terms of pharmaceuticals. And eventually the country is going to go bankrupt or something similar. Like whatever has to happen, they can't just print money forever. So it's not endless. So I think healthcare expenditures are some ridiculously high percentage of the total expenditures from the government, from the country. And so junk food will bankrupt us eventually. Basically, I mean, you could blame it on junk food or blame it on some other related things, but it is essentially the junk food that's doing it. All right. So what do you do with all this information? Well, basically, junk food and social media are both anathema to a healthy life. They're both something that's going to drag you down. So the less exposure you have to junk food or social media, the better off you are. And so think about how you can reduce your exposure to each of those, how you can reduce them or eliminate them from your life, or at least have a periodic time when you're completely abstaining from one or the other or both. Like if you fast for a week, like I'm doing right now, then you're not having any junk food, obviously, but you could also just eat only whole foods or something, real food for a week and see what that feels like. But then in terms of the social media, you could do the same thing. You could fast from all those types of apps and stuff for a week and see how that feels. Or just, gradually get rid of them anyway. And in both cases, you're going to be setting a better example for your kids if you have kids, and helping them be healthier if you reduce your exposure and their exposure to each of these things, to junk food and to social media. So I think if you want to, again, check out the documentary, The Social Dilemma. If you haven't seen it before, it's going to make more sense in terms of the social media component. And then if you want to get more of a handle on why junk food versus real food is a big deal, listen to episode 7 of my podcast. I think it's audio only, so you'll have to look up my podcast, the FastingWell Podcast. FastingWell is all one word. And you can find episode 7. So I don't think that one's on YouTube. But if you're on YouTube, I've got a playlist, which you can see right here. It's all about nutrition. So it has various interviews and shorter videos and meal ideas and so forth that can maybe help you get a better handle on nutrition and kind of think about how you want to eat in a healthy way for a happy and long life. Thanks for listening or watching, and I'll see you next time on Fasting Well.